What if the most demanding struggle the Norse people faced wasn't on foreign shores, but right at home? Not a clash of warriors, but an annual, silent confrontation with an adversary that never tired. Relentless cold and unbroken darkness. When winters swallowed the landscape, when fjords froze into pale stone, and the sun only brushed the horizon for a moment each day, that was when their real battle began. Snow piled high against their longhouses, and every sunrise marked another day of shrinking food stores. In those months, survival depended less on the roar of a berserker and far more on the clear-headed planning of whoever guarded the pantry keys. What kept a clan alive wasn't luck, it was engineering. Smoke, frost, salt, and time were the Vikings' most reliable allies. They learned to trap life inside barrels, on rafters, and beneath the ground, transforming fleeting summer harvests into winter-long reserves. They froze, dried, smoked, and fermented their way through the harshest season on Earth. Stay until the end, and you'll discover the hidden preservation systems that kept Viking families alive, and why their greatest brilliance wasn't found on the battlefield, but in the storerooms behind their doors. The hidden architecture of survival. One of the Vikings' best-kept secrets had nothing to do with blades or shields. It was the layout of their storage structures, a quietly masterful design built for no purpose other than defeating hunger. A longhouse wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a food-preserving machine. Beneath the floorboards, often directly under the hearth or in the coolest corner, lay a dugout chamber. This underground room, essentially an early form of a cellar, relied on the Earth's constant temperature to protect delicate supplies from freezing or rotting. Inside, barrels, jars, and tightly sealed containers held the community's most precious assets. Above, in the rafters, was another ingenious space. Because longhouses lacked chimneys, warm smoke from the central fire drifted upward and lingered near the roof beams. Instead of letting that smoke go to waste, the Vikings used it as a natural preservative. Strips of fish and meat hung from the rafters, slowly turning into smoky, durable provisions. Outside the home stood buildings raised on wooden or stone stilts, specialized barns designed specifically for storing grain. These elevated structures kept moisture and pests at bay. Slots cut into their walls encouraged a steady flow of dry air, preventing mold. Everything, even the locks on the doors, symbolized how valuable these stores were. This wasn't random architecture, it was a timed system. Perishable foods were eaten first, smoked, dried, and salted supplies were reserved for the darkest stretch of winter. Through these systems, the Vikings accumulated more than just enough to survive. They built up surplus, the fuel that powered shipbuilding, exploration, and the far-reaching voyages that reshaped medieval Europe. When people imagine Viking meals, they often picture feasts overflowing with roasted meat. But in reality, the foundation of their diet, and nearly all their winter calories, came from something far more humble: grain. Without grain, there would have been no strength for work, travel, or exploration. Barley was the true lifeline of the North. Hardy enough to grow in rocky soils and short summers, it was the crop that rarely failed. From it came dense breads, filling porridge, and the everyday ale that kept families hydrated when water sources were unsafe. Rye and oats were also staples. Rye made dark, long-lasting bread, while oats were cooked into warm morning porridge that could sustain hours of labor in the cold. Turning grain into food was a daily ritual. Women spent hours grinding dried kernels with heavy handstones. The rhythmic scraping of stone against stone was part of the soundtrack of life in every longhouse. The most common dish was a thick porridge, filling, nutritious, and endlessly adaptable. Anything available could be added: dried berries, a spoonful of honey, or a bit of butter when fortune smiled. As for bread, it wasn't soft or airy like modern loaves. Instead, it was usually flat, unleavened, and cooked right on heated stones or skillets. It was tough, dense, and incredibly sustaining. Grain wasn't merely food. It was wealth. A well-stocked grain barn signaled a prosperous household. It enabled trade, providing the means to acquire iron, salt, and other essentials. Protecting this resource required meticulous planning. Grain had to be dried perfectly after harvest, then stored in elevated barns where the wind could sweep between the sacks and keep moisture away. White gold, the dairy that fueled the North. Surprisingly, one of the Vikings' most powerful survival tools wasn't meat or grain. It was dairy. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, so the Norse devised clever ways to preserve it. One of their greatest successes was a product similar to a soft, protein-rich cheese. Made by slowly culturing milk and draining off the whey, it became a concentrated source of nourishment that could last for weeks in a cool cellar. Families ate it plain, mixed it into porridge, or thinned it with water into a refreshing drink. The leftover whey was equally useful. It doubled as a tangy, acidic preservative that could be poured over food to slow spoilage. Nothing was wasted. But the real treasure of the dairy world was butter. During the lush summer months, when cows grazed on fresh grass, milk was abundant, and the Vikings transformed as much of it as possible into butter. Compact and calorie-dense, it was essential winter fuel. Preserving butter required ingenuity. Salted butter was ideal, but salt was rare and costly. So they developed a remarkable alternative: storing butter in peat bogs. Packed into barrels or wrapped in bark and buried in the cold, oxygen-poor bog, the butter could last for years. Its flavor became strong and unusual, but it remained edible and incredibly valuable. The protein board that fed an era. Now imagine a food so light you could carry months' worth of it, yet so durable that it barely aged over a decade. This was one of the Vikings' greatest economic engines: dried cod, or what later generations called stockfish. Along the northern Norwegian coast, especially in the Lofoten region, massive schools of Arctic cod arrived every winter. The Vikings perfected a method of preserving this resource using nothing but the climate itself. After gutting the fish, they tied them in pairs and hung them on tall wooden racks. The frigid air froze the fish instantly, while steady winter winds slowly pulled out their moisture. Cold temperatures halted bacterial growth, meaning no salt was needed. After several months, the fish became incredibly hard, almost like a plank of wood, but packed with nutrition. This protein board was the ideal food for long sea voyages. Lightweight, low volume, and nearly indestructible, it traveled with crews to Iceland, Greenland, and even the coast of North America. Before eating, they soaked it for days and hammered it to soften the fibers. Once revived, it became a key ingredient in stews or was eaten with butter and bread. Meat may not have been eaten daily, but when the Vikings did preserve it, they used methods so effective that some are still practiced today. Livestock couldn't be kept through the winter in large numbers. The hay simply wouldn't last. So autumn became the great butchering season. Fresh cuts were enjoyed immediately, often turning into celebratory feasts. But most of the meat had a more important purpose: long-term storage. Smoke, the hearth's hidden technology. Inside every longhouse, the central fire served more than warmth and cooking. Without chimneys, smoke drifted upward and collected under the roof beams, and the Vikings turned this inconvenience into a survival tool. Strips and chunks of meat were hung in this smoky upper space for weeks, sometimes months. Smoke dried the meat slowly. Its natural chemicals kept bacteria at bay, and the constant exposure deterred insects. The result was a dark, firm, aromatic product that could hang above the family all winter long. When needed, they sliced off pieces for soup, stew, or to eat with dense flatbread. Some regions relied heavily on air drying as well, especially for lamb and mutton. In the mountains of Norway, cold winds created perfect conditions for producing dried hams, a tradition still alive today. Salt. Scarce, precious, powerful. Nothing preserved meat better than salt. The problem? Salt itself was a luxury. True salt deposits were rare in the far north, meaning salt often had to be imported or painstakingly produced by evaporating seawater. But wherever families could spare enough of it, salting became their most reliable method. Meat was cut into portions, packed tightly into barrels, and smothered in thick layers of salt. Moisture was drawn out, bacteria were stopped in their tracks, and the meat became shelf-stable for months, even years. Before eating, it was soaked to remove the excess salt. These barrels were prized reserves, often saved for journeys or dire times. Fermentation, when nature did the work. What happened when they lacked salt and the weather was too damp for drying? They turned to a method we would today call controlled biochemistry. Fermentation. The Vikings unknowingly harnessed beneficial bacteria to transform perishable foods into safe, long-lasting staples. It was risky, but it worked, and in some places, it was the only workable solution. The most dramatic example is the preparation of Greenland shark, whose fresh flesh is full of toxins. By burying the meat under gravel for weeks, letting fluids drain, and then hanging it to dry for months, they created a food with a harsh aroma but safe, stable nutrition, a resource that meant survival in the farthest settlements. They fermented trout too, lightly salting it and sealing it in barrels to mature in its own juices. Over time, the bones softened, and the fish turned into a pungent, spreadable food valued in mountainous areas. Early forms of fermented herring also trace back to this era, just salty enough not to rot, but still alive with fermentation. To modern tastes, these foods seem shocking, but to the Vikings, they were triumphs of ingenuity. Underground gardens, winter's vegetables. Not everything in a Viking cellar was meat or grain. These underground rooms doubled as storage for the last vegetables of the growing season, the quiet heroes of winter survival. Root vegetables were essential: turnips, rutabagas, hardy wild carrots. Pulled from the ground late in autumn, they were cleaned but not washed, then packed in boxes layered with dry sand or moss. This kept humidity stable and prevented rot. In these conditions, roots lasted for months, often until spring. They became the foundation of winter stews, long simmered dishes where vegetables cooked together with a small piece of smoked or salted meat. Cabbage was stored too, but Vikings also embraced fermentation long before it became fashionable. Finely shredded cabbage, pressed down with a bit of salt, turned into a form of early sauerkraut. This tangy, vitamin-rich food helped prevent deficiencies during the coldest months. The forest pantry: nuts, berries, herbs. The wilderness surrounding Norse settlements offered more than game. It provided vital winter calories and nutrients. if people gathered them in time. Hazelnuts were among the most valuable wild foods. Once sealed in their shells, they could last for years. Packed with fats, they were a perfect emergency ration. They were eaten raw, ground into paste, or added to porridge. Berries were gathered eagerly. Lingonberries, cranberries, wild raspberries, cloudberries. While berries spoiled quickly, they could be dried or, thanks to their natural acidity, submerged in clean, cold water and stored for months. With honey, they became a luxury treat reserved for special occasions. Dried herbs like nettle, wild garlic, and angelica added flavor to winter meals and doubled as medicine. Ale and mead, drinks that sustained a people. In an age when water wasn't always safe to drink, fermented beverages were essential. Ale, low in alcohol, cloudy, and nutritious, was the daily drink. Made from barley and sometimes oats, it was essentially liquid food. Brewing required careful timing and skill, as wasting grain on a bad batch was a significant loss. Mead, on the other hand, was a celebration drink. Honey was precious, so mead was brewed only for important ceremonies, weddings, funerals, midwinter feasts. Stronger and sweeter than ale, it carried a special meaning in Viking culture. The famine gap, when all else failed. Despite all their planning, some winters outlasted their stores. When spring came late and cellars emptied, families entered the most dreaded season, the hunger gap. In these weeks, they turned to foods of desperation. Pine and elm bark yielded a thin, edible inner layer, which could be dried and ground into a bitter flour. Mixed with the last handful of real grain, it created bark bread. Heavy, resinous, barely food, but enough to quiet hunger. If bark wasn't available, people used dried roots, moss, even boiled leather scraped from old shoes. Anything that could supply a trace of calories became part of the struggle for survival. These harsh experiences reinforced the importance of the preservation system the Vikings built so carefully. Their winter diet wasn't a luxury, it was a masterpiece of adaptation.